So good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody from COP27, Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. I'm really delighted to be here with you today. We have a great panel to discuss about food security and climate change. Let me first really thank, we're so honored to be here in the Ukrainian pavilion. We're really grateful for the Ukrainian delegation to host us here. So today we're going to discuss about the interplay between food security and climate change. But let me start with a few premises. Next week, actually, I think, next week, the world is going to welcome the 8th billion citizen. And actually in 2050 will be 10 billion. So you may argue that actually the global food systems have managed to deliver the goods. They provided the food that actually the world needs. This though has come with a number of premises. Availability of cheap, abundant fossil fuel and fossil fuel-based inputs, but also the assumption that the world can absorb infinitely the environmental degradation that unsustainable practice bring. What you've seen though recently, the war on Ukraine, the energy crisis, there are external shocks that are really challenging these premises. On top of that, the main challenge of climate change and the anticipated and actually experienced effect of climate change and the disruption they bring on food value chains, on the value of companies, on the competitiveness of companies operating in this sector. We're going to discuss all of this today and really explore how climate change is going to affect food security in a very complex environment, in a world that have to deal with so many multiple crises. As I mentioned, we have a really great panel here with us. We have Vicky Gunderson from the US Treasury. We have Inkar Kadizermova from the FAO. We have Marta Trofimova from Kernel, Ukraine. Actually, I have to be very grateful to you, Marta, because you agreed to stay an extra day. So we're really grateful that you managed. We have Iride Ceccaci from EBRD, and also we have Anish Jain connected remotely from ETG. So let me start this conversation. And I also invite really the public to intervene and ask questions. But let me start the conversation with you, Vicky. I would be interested to know, first of all, why you're interested in food security, but crucially, what you think is the role of governments in facilitating and enabling investment in the food system in a context of climate change.
Well, thank you so much. I'll speak a little bit louder. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to EBRD for hosting. The Ukraine Pavilion, for those that are online, is quite compelling and is an experience in itself. So I want to thank the host for allowing us to be here. Food security. I mean, first and foremost, we all need to eat, and it's a luxury and a privilege to be able to have food every day with a secure environment. And that's not something that we take lightly. Additionally, many around the world don't have that ability. The food insecurity crisis is being exacerbated. It's being harshened by the effects of climate change, by Russia's unprovoked war in the Ukraine, and the spillover effects are just compounding. According to the World Food Program, more than 70 million people will be food insecure just based upon the war in Ukraine. That's unacceptable in many ways, and there's a response that's needed by governments, both those that have the ability to enable, to respond, and to help our fellow citizens. This is about people at the end of the day. When we think about, from a US perspective, what our role is, there's some obvious ones. Mobilizing resources to help humanitarian crisis. Just this year, the US mobilized $10 billion in response to the humanitarian crisis and addressing some of the long-term effects. There's a short-term need just to respond, but there's a long-term emphasis to be secure in the future. There's a couple of ways, particularly at COP, when we think about the interplay between food security and climate change and a clear linkage. And so one of the things that governments can do, which is set plans. We all know how the importance of planning, long-term investments. And one of the things that we've done, the president, as he was here yesterday from the United States, President Biden launched PREPARE, the president's acronyms, President's Emergency Resilience and Preparedness Response Plan. I think he butchered it in his speech too, and I'm going to not remember what it is here because we have these acronyms that I'm just, Anyways, we call it PREPARE anyways, which is the largest investment for climate adaptation.
We're all suffering from
I
acronym
know,
fatigue.
it's
Don't worry.
awful. It's day 5. Anyways, PREPARE, the largest investment in the US in climate adaptation, and there's a clear role for food security in that effort. There was $150 million announced just for Africa yesterday by the president. We're continuing to see improvements, and these are those long-term investments. So setting plans, mobilizing resources quickly to response, and perhaps we can talk about the role as the panel goes on about convening other governments, convening the institutions in which we're shareholders, and setting a global framework and action plans related to climate.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Irkan, Vicky is really starting to give a hint to my question, in fact, because she's talking about the role of government, but also how food is becoming more and more relevant in the COP negotiations. It would be interesting if you can give us your perspective on that, and also what the FAO is doing in this field.
Much for the question. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yes, Vicky, thank you. You made a good introduction and the segue to my point. As we know, this is the COP, which is labeled the COP for implementation, and it's also the African COP. And we're very happy to see that exactly at this point in time, the agriculture is at the highest point in the negotiations. For those of you who follow negotiations, you know that this is a very decisive point. This is the end of the 5-year cycle of negotiations under the Karanivia Joint Work on Agriculture. And just today in the morning, a couple of maybe minutes ago, we saw that the draft negotiating text has been published online. At the moment, there are still remaining brackets in the text. So it means that the negotiations will continue into the high-level segments. So the senior leaders of the delegations will continue working on the text next week. So it only shows and demonstrates to us that even though everybody understands the importance of the issue, there are still dividing lines, and there are still a few open questions that have to be breached, and the compromises need to be found. I heard from the colleagues that at the last informal consultation last night, both chairs of the SBs called parties to find the agreements and to close the text and to come to the conclusion. So we really look forward to the negotiations next week, because we think that it is an important point that an agreement is found, and that the process under the Karanivia is propelled to the next phase, which is the phase of implementation. The reason why we're really looking forward to that is that, as many have already mentioned, the world is really suffering from the increasing risks on the food security. The climate impacts are exacerbating. The numbers of people suffering from malnutrition, from hunger is really staggering. And these numbers are could be even conservative projections, because we know that there are additional crises that are being added. And unfortunately, the ones who are engaged in the agriculture sector are among those who are most vulnerable and most poor at the moment. So what FAO is doing is actually quite a lot at this particular COP, but also in preparation to the COP. This time we are working very closely with the presidency, with the government of Egypt, on launching at least 4 initiatives that closely relate to agriculture and food security. And one that is actually being launched right now as we speak, it's called the FAST, Food and Agriculture Sustainable Transformation. Then later in the day, there will be another initiative launched on integration of the discussion on nutrition and climate change. And then there will be water initiative launched, and later next week, the initiative on reduction of food loss and waste. So the amount of energy, effort, technical support, engagement from the government is really high and growing.
Thank you very much, Inga. This shows indeed that food is becoming a central piece of the discussion on climate change, and I assume next COP will also feature very prominently. Let me go to Marta. Your company is a global leader in edible oil, but you're also a leader in sustainability. Clearly, in the current context, you operate in a war zone. It's challenging to retain, all these objectives. But I like to understand how you are preparing for the challenges of climate change. in the complex context you're living in, and also how you see the role of a company like Kernel, which is a global leader in really helping creating the market conditions for addressing climate change.
Okay, thank you. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for inviting. I think it's very great to see that we are getting more and more of these discussions about the role of agriculture in delivering goals of the Paris Agreement. And it's a pleasure for me to share some of the practical insights and experience from my company in Ukraine. So I work as a sustainability manager at Kernel, which is the largest in Ukraine and the world's leading producer of sunflower oil. And in my role, I'm responsible for the development and for the leading of the overall climate agenda of the company. And over the last year, this work largely overlapped with the management of the project called Climate Corporate Governance and Low Carbon Pathway that we've been implementing together with EBRD and EY. And I'm really excited to share some of the achievements that we made so far throughout the targets of this project. Namely, in terms of governance, we have recently established a sustainability committee at the board of directors. The high-level committee that will be responsible for overseeing and for providing critical inputs to the climate agenda and low carbon development agenda at Kernel. We have also undertaken a in-depth scenario-based analysis of climate physical and transitional risks. And we are now working towards the integrating these approaches into the overall risk management framework in the company. And we've also identified and analyzed some of the key priority business opportunities that are associated with the low carbon development, and we're moving forward to implementing them. And lastly, we have expanded the scope of our GHG emission accounting, namely by calculating the scope 3 emissions. Also, just to mention on the governance point, we have started introducing climate-related KPIs throughout the whole executive management team in all business segments. At the moment, they are qualitative and they're focusing on the developing the comprehensive GHG emission accounting system throughout the company, which would give us the opportunity to track a carbon intensity of our products throughout the whole value chain. And so a lot of this work was actually done not just in spite of war, but it was actually a lot of it was done after the war has already started. And there are two main reasons why we remain so committed to our climate actions and to our climate ambitions despite the situation. First of all, and this is once again to building on what speakers already mentioned about, and where I want to draw a parallel between climate change and between military actions. We as company in Ukraine, we know firsthand what it means when your normal business operations are disrupted, when your normal supply chain and your logistic channels comes with great challenges, when the well-being of your employees is under threat. And it all happens due to powers that are outside of your control. And when we're talking about climate change, the impacts of extreme weather events that are the frequency of which is increasing due to climate change, these impacts can also be as harmful. We also cannot control them when they happen, just as we cannot control the shelling and the rocket missiles being launched over our heads. But the one factor that makes it different from the unprovoked and quite unexpected Russian military aggression against Ukraine is that right now we are lucky enough to know about climate change. We already know that it's happening. We've seen it in Ukraine, especially in some of the central areas in Ukraine that had been officially declared an area of critical agriculture and is getting harder each year to produce some of the key commodities in there. We know that it's happening and we can be prepared. There are some of the very concrete actions that we can take in terms of mitigating the impact by strengthening our low carbon agriculture practices, by reducing the emissions, and there are actions that we can take to adapt to these changes. So for us, really, the climate actions is just a wise long-term business planning that we are taking. And a second reason for that is that we at Kernel, we do not see the international climate agenda that comes with the regulation and with all of the legislation as a compliance issue and as an extra burden, but we rather see it as a area for new opportunities Just to give you an example, there's been a lot of talks about decarbonization of supply chain is becoming a big thing. The scope 3 emissions are getting more and more scrutiny. They're now going to be a mandatory disclosure by the under the IFRS sustainability standards, and so on and so forth. And for now, for us, this is where we see a lot of room for building up the partnership and collaboration with our trade partners to identify mutual initiatives that we can implement together. And this is where in this direction we've been working over the last couple of months. I cannot share a lot of detail because it's now still work in progress, but just to give you the overall idea, what is our philosophy, what is our approach, we believe that Kernel can be a reliable and trusted partner in decarbonizing supply chain of our trade partners. So it's all about collaboration and making a mutual impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. Talking about resilience, let me introduce now the dear colleague Iride, who leads the agribusiness advisory activities of the EBRD. Iride, can you tell us why food security matters to the EBRD and what we are doing and the interplay between climate change and food security, particularly under the perspective of facilitating the investments?
I think it's very important to be here today and to start the conversation from the Ukrainian pavilion. Food security has been a theme in the EBRD agribusiness space since 2012 for many different reasons. It was market prices at that time, and then since February it was again a big shock. In the middle of Europe, it was Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe indeed. And the two agendas that we are pursuing, decarbonization on the one hand, climate and food security, are really going together. When we support companies like Kernel or other private sector companies that are implementing sustainability, then, you know, food security also becomes sustainable. So how to foster a sustainable food security maybe is the question at this COP. So our agenda is really twofold: decarbonizing value chains and you know, working on the food security, particularly in our region where we have countries that are net exporters of commodities and countries like CEMED countries, MENA countries that import those vital commodities for their population, especially from Russia and Ukraine. I mean, if we look at Egypt, I think 30% of overall imports come from Russia and Ukraine, and they import a lot, more than 50% of their total consumption. So how do we make sure that these trade flows continue, especially when there are shocks? And shocks can be a war, conflict, or climate shocks, as Marta was referring to. So since the start of the war in Ukraine, the EBRD continued support private sector players in the Ukraine through its own capital. So we invested in agribusiness companies ourselves and via partner bank for about 100 million. And we also kept going lines for trade facilitation programs among countries for about 140 million euros. And these were focusing on key crops and commodities, but also fertilizers and machineries to make sure that the flows of goods continues. At the same time, we also saw that countries like Tunisia were really struggling to secure commodities in their own countries and to import these commodities, especially wheat and barley, to actually feed their population. So for the first time, we supported via a sovereign lending to ODC, which is an agency of the government in Tunisia, to buy at that point in time where they were really struggling and prices were really high, about 15% of their consumption. And you can see this as many different investments that are only dealing with food security, but we are never forgetting that our longer goal is to make the food system more sustainable. So the EBRD is working with the FAO on a food security program with technical assistance and advisory that also looks at local crops, how we can grow better different foods, different and more nutritious foods in countries where there are climate restrictions, and which type of practices we need to foster in these countries as well. So it's a global agenda, decarbonization on one side, food security on the other, but the two things need to go together and become a bit more sustainable. Can we do this? Can we do this with our partners? I believe we can.
Thank you very much, Iride. So we heard the perspective of a government, of a policy organization like the FAO, business, multilateral. Anish, I want to come to you because you have a quite unique experience. You are a global trader of agricultural commodities. So you know a thing or two about, the threats and the challenge and the risks. Risks are very much part of your daily business. But also you've been very active, in fact, pioneering approaches to look at deforestation and environmental degradation in your practice. I would really like to hear your perspective about the topic we're discussing today, but also if you can share your reflection about whether the private sector you think is ready to address these challenges and what is missing perhaps to make sure that actually these considerations are taken into account to drive investment decisions. Over to you, Anish.
Yeah, thank you so much. And first of all, pleasure to be part of this session. Thanks to EBRD and COP for inviting us. I think as an organization, as a corporate, we have done multiple interventions over the last couple of years, which allow us to see that how climate change is impacting the production and trading of the staple crops, and also what is the impact on the farmers who are actually producing these crops. Because a lot of time when we talk about consumers who are consuming these, but what about the farmers who are producing? So we as an organization have been running multiple projects. Two projects I would like to specifically highlight here that addresses climate change, biodiversity, as well as the food loss. So the first project that we started in 2019, it was done in collaboration with Wageningen University in the Netherlands, where we have studied how the climate change is impacting the soil and biodiversity and what kind of crops are getting produced over empirical evidence of last 30 years, and then projecting the crop production for next 20 years. So this kind of study helped us to understand that what kind of climate changes we need to adapt and how we need to apply those changes into the farming techniques so that the food production still continues to happen. The second project that we did is a precision farming agricultural project where we have used and taken the assistance of aerial drones and to study the coffee and tea plantation activities across selected African markets. The idea was to collect real-time data and monitor this data to understand what kind of agronomic practices farmers are doing, how to increase the yield and resilience of these crops, and at the same time, how these farmers can improve the yield so that more and more food can be produced and offered to the world. So these kind of projects really helped us to design right kind of agronomy practices and offer to the supply chain that post-harvest food loss can also be reduced. At the same time, we have started working on establishing a very well-oiled hub and spoke warehousing network model by having more than 500 hub and spoke warehouses across Africa. We have seen that in many countries, especially the Eastern and the Central African countries, where post-harvest food loss used to be 48, 49% 20 years ago. Now with constant intervention of 2 decades, that post-harvest food loss has come down to 32, 33%. So this is a big achievement that we see, and it is not only ETG, but it is a collective effort done by multiple organizations in different countries, which has helped us to reduce PFHL from 48% to 32%. So I think these kind of projects needs to be implemented. We have seen lately in last 6 to 7 years, a lot of governments have come forward, such as US government, Dutch government, German government, where they have partnered with us to help execute these projects because we have the expertise on the ground and we understand that how to implement these projects directly linking with the farmers. So I think these kind of interventions are very, very important to address biodiversity and climate change and also address the reforestation and deforestation issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anish. I would stay with you if you don't mind, also to enjoy the very stable connection that is not being necessarily always the case in the last few days. Actually, you mentioned a couple of things that are very interesting for me. You know, you raised the importance of technologies, but also the importance of partnerships. I'd like to hear your perspective in terms of what are your plans for the future, maybe also in the context of applying new technology, but also how to build effective partnerships within supply chains, but also more horizontally.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question. And I think I would like to start answering it by addressing the benefit that we derive in executing these projects along with partnerships. If you look at some of the projects like we do for forestation activities and rehabilitation, every year we farm more than 250,000 indigenous shade trees in different sectors. And also we have been working with the governments to do the rehabilitation of a couple of crops. Like for example, across Kenya and Zambia, we have worked with the government to rehabilitate more than 200,000 hectares of land for rekindling the cashew farming in these activities. And this has directly impacted and benefited more than 500,000 farmers and people working in the farming value chain. So coming on to the main question about how partnerships can help, had it been only ETG as an organization, we would not have achieved this kind of activities. But having strong partnerships with international organizations like IFC, South Pole, Alcott, Norwegian University, McKinsey, FMO, DEG, these partners have helped us to really implement these projects. And the most recent one, earlier this week at COP27, our climate desk has officially launched a program which is called Emerging Farmer Carbon Abatement Program. This is also done in collaboration with multiple governments, how to educate farmers and bring to a level where they understand the carbon footprint and devise techniques and methods to start reducing the carbon footprint in their value chain and production process. So certainly these partnerships play a very important role. It starts with a very basic understanding of the project and the objectives we want to achieve. And then the step 2 is the policy intervention, where the partners together go to the governments and ask for certain policy interventions which allow larger benefit to come in multiple countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anish. This is very impressive. Actually, maybe I'd like to bring Inkar back into the conversation, because we've heard the perspective of the private sector. Arguably, ETG and Canada are market leaders also in the area of sustainability. But it seems to me that the private sector is starting to really become more proactive, if not because the perception of risk and how risk affect the bottom line of business is becoming more clear and evident. You talked about the progress in the negotiations. You talked about the work of the FAO really to provide the technical and policy expertise. But it seems to me that there is still a gap. It's still ways to go in order to bring food security and the issue of food and climate change at the center of the negotiation. So can you maybe elaborate a bit more on how you see the gaps, how you see the way forward?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, we see that, as I already mentioned, the attention to agriculture is increasing. We have been carefully monitoring the commitments that were captured in the nationally determined contributions that were submitted by most of the parties under the convention in the first and in the second round. And we have seen that the level of commitment is increasing between the rounds. More than 90% of the countries have already included concrete policies and measures relating to adaptation and mitigation in the agriculture and food security areas in their NDCs. We also have seen that the countries with the significant share of emissions coming from the livestock, rice, and soil carbon sources have described very specific, very doable, economically feasible and tested measures in their NDCs. So we are very hopeful that there will be a significant step forward in the area of mitigation. On the side of the adaptation, we also have seen that there are emerging common threats, that the adaptation measures have been included at the level of the farm gate measures, at the systemic measures, at the level of the research and capacity building. But however, we know that the combined effect of all the NDCs as it is now is still not enough. We still face a significant gap, and if the level of commitments remains as it is now, unfortunately, I don't think that we'll reach the required trajectory for the world community to remain on track to reach the 1.5 degree goal. So when we have analyzed this whole bulk of information that came from the parties, including in the NDCs, in the NAPs, and in the party-driven reports, we have seen that there are at least 5 major gaps. And then they are the ones that relate to the poor level of compliance and the challenges relating to tracking and accountability of parties in order to to fully understand the effect of their measures in agriculture. There is also a challenge in reaching comprehensive and coherent policy frameworks. Unfortunately, those policymakers that are working in the area of agriculture and the ones that work in the area of environment protection and climate change at the national level do not necessarily talk to each other and do not maybe necessarily synchronize their policies at the national level. We also have seen that there are gaps in the research, policy, and tools, even though we know that the IPCC reports and there were so many other sources produced by the well-reputed international organizations, they're very clear and they have identified the economically feasible measures, the adaptation potential, the mitigation potential have also been estimated. There are still gaps in having the practical tools that would enable the policymakers to translate the science-based recommendations into practical policy actions. And then two additional gap areas, which already have been mentioned by the speakers here, is the gap in investment and the gap in the action by the private sector. So we have to really make a lot of additional effort to make the climate action economically attractive and feasible, especially for the small scale farmers who really do not have enough means to go for the massive modernization in order to upgrade their systems.
Thank you very much, Inka. And thank you also for bringing the issue of the insufficient flows of finance going into improving the sustainability of the sector. I would like to come back to you, Vicky, because the nexus between, food security and climate change, food, water, energy has been, really the topic of this week. Egypt has launched the flagship initiative, the NUEFE, of which the EBRD has been a proud supporter, but also the US has been a great supporter. And actually, John Kerry has been very vocal about the importance of establishing these links. Can you perhaps elaborate a bit on the, what is the vision of the US, in order to help really creating the instrument that can address the challenges associated to this nexus, but also what is the importance of global partnerships in this context?
Sure, thank you so much for Matt. And the best part of panels is I get ideas as we go. And I think Inka just hit on a couple of things. So I said the US has committed 10 billion this year to the humanitarian crisis and food security. That's not one agency, that's across the US government. So the US Treasury, US Agency for International Development, the State Department, or other partners. The Prepare Plan, so 3 billion as a target for adaptation related climate, is an interagency effort, and some processes there. And when I look at Treasury's role, there's two things I would just highlight. So I'm from the US Treasury, we oversee some of the private sector related work. So it's always good to hear about disclosures and data and risk management. But it's also one of the key roles as we have is overseeing the multilateral development banks and the primary engagement with the international financial institutions. And so from partnerships, both within our government, but then with our partners globally, in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the growing food security crisis, Secretary Yellen, so the Secretary of the Treasury, convened the heads of the international financial institutions to say, we need to coordinate. The speed and the scale at which we need to respond both to the climate crisis is pressing, but also the food crisis is being exasperated. And we need closer coordination on this particular issue. And so convening those heads, out came an action plan. The teams that worked on that action plan were under quite a bit of fire. It came out in, I think, the most rapid action plan I've ever seen, weeks, not months, not years. So when there is top level ability from governments to convene, there's moral imperative, there's real commitment by organizations. You can see plans come out, which then actually lead to real investments, real developments. And so one of those plans, there were 6 core principles in the action plan, one of which was related to climate. A number of investments came out, a couple of them being $500 million that the US gave to EBRD for food security and implications from Ukraine across the region. So that thinking about how we compel money immediately, we put $155 million into Gatsby, which allowed them to continue to create a call for proposals, the first time in I think since the pandemic. EFAD, investments into EFAD. So we're using those multilateral institutions so that by catalyzing and putting some money in, it can then garner and mobilize the entire global community to touch on practitioners. So that's one thing, which is the IFI working plan. I'd be remiss, as you noted, policies need ministries to coordinate. And so this year, the G20 actually hosted the first finance and agricultural ministerial. And for anyone who speaks government, that is like an act of God, because in the G20 concept, there's a Sherpa track and a finance track, and the tracks never meet, except this was a key example of where we got ministers together across the G20 to say, we need to talk to each other. Agriculture ministries and finance ministries need to coordinate. Out of that came a mapping exercise that FAO is working on. Just this coming week, leaders should be endorsing that mapping exercise. And I understand there's a roadmap for next year that will come out of that. And so hopefully from a government perspective, we can use our convening power to get the right people in the room, to have those conversations, to send the right signals, to then empower the international community to work on the ground. I love hearing the stories from actual practitioners, because I see the higher level policy environment, but really it's not effective if it isn't meaningful action. Companies, small farmers, actual people are receiving the aid, the assistance, and the signals that are needed in order to create that enabling environment that's so important for us.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting to observe these changes, which clearly can really build a framework for the investments to flow at scale. Talking about investment, Marta, I would like to come back to you, because to facilitate investments, to allow finance to flow to private companies, what is crucial is to establish effective risk management practices. Ultimately, we're a bank, we price risk, we provide finance on the back of the information we know. So what is Kernel doing to strengthen risk management practices, but also what you expect will be the evolution of these in the coming years?
Thank you for the question. So I think also building up on what was already mentioned, there are 2 key points that kind of interact. First of all is the availability of data and the possibility to collect this data and to account this data in a very comprehensive, transparent way, and have the possibility to also assure it in the future, so that it can be a trusted source of information, not just inside the company for the internal decision-making operations, but also for the outside, for the trade partners, for the supply chain, etc. It is something that we experienced when we started working on the more in-depth accounting of the carbon footprint of our operations. And then we came outside and started talking to our trade partners, to other companies. That is when we realized that it's a lack of data in terms of carbon intensity on the market. So we spent a lot of months and we've been spending a lot of years talking about how do we reduce the current level of emissions, how do we decarbonize? But then we actually got to the question, wait a minute, what is the actual current carbon intensity and carbon footprint of our production? This would be the very first question, to the very first point to target at all levels. It is availability of data. And the second point is that also a capacity building for the beneficiaries of those investments on the ground. So just to give you an example, when we're talking about the climate adaptation measures, for example, in agriculture sector, there would be the most obvious one, the irrigation and the drainage systems. And in Ukraine, we started a very active work in terms of developing the irrigation system. There's been a legislation recently adopted for the establishment of the water use organizations that would allow the different type of farmers and market players, starting from small partners, ending up with a huge agro holdings, to get together and to ensure that they can distribute the water and the irrigation systems properly. And there's also a national strategy in Ukraine in terms of the expansion of the irrigation system in the next 10 or 20 years. The thing that we hear from actual people on the ground, that they lack knowledge, the practical knowledge on how to actually operate the hydrotechnology systems. So this is what we need. I mean, we can, there's a high level policies and all of the decision making, but when we come to the ground, we need to make sure that people know how to use these resources in the most effective way.
Thank you, Marta. Iride, I'd like to go back to you because Vicky talked about strategy at the government level. Both Anish and Marta talked about strategy at the corporate level. What about DBRD? I also would like, if you can expand on the role of partnership, because I believe that we touched upon, but would like to hear your view on that.
Thank you, Giampiero. Indeed, there are a lot of things that I can pick on, like you did before. So I want to start with Vicky. It is true, at the moment in March, I think it was this year, right after the Ukraine war situation collapsed, and the US Treasury really brought all the IFIs in one room. And through this action plan for food insecurity, we could really think which are our strengths and to contribute to the food security situation and how we can all raise funds in order to actually tackle food insecurity. And coordination and partnerships are really key in this area. I just want to give one data. We talk about the relationship between climate and food security and financing. Out of all climate funds, only 3% is devoted to the agriculture sector. And the agriculture sector emits, I think, up to 30% of global emission and waste 30% of food. So how can we all finance and scale up financing, but in the right way? When Inkar was speaking about NDCs, right, and policies, all these policies need to be tailored down and implemented into projects financed by financing institutions like the EBRD, and then implemented by private sector players on the ground like Kernel and ETG. So how can we translate these targets in a way that we can finance it, that data help us to understand which areas we need to tackle, and then in which way we can monitor it on the ground to actually see which outcomes this project are bringing. So DBRD is very ambitious. And by January 2023, all our projects need to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. So we are working with clients and with other IFIs and MDBs on methodologies to actually see what does it mean to incorporate this and transform it in an outcome that a private sector player can understand and actually bring about. Because in the end, then it's the private sector that has to deliver, right? So as a bank, not only we need to provide more financing to the sector, be it food security, be it climate, but also be tailoring, our approaches and our products in order for us to better understand through due diligence, through advisory program, through partnership, and to technical assistance on the ground, what we can really bring about. And for me, if I can add just one little thing, it was really incredible, this COP, because this COP is a lot about adaptation. It is true. I mean, and this is really difficult, mitigation technologies are there. There is an agtech revolution in our sector, but the mitigation at the level of the farmer, which activities, which practices, how to bring this about in irrigation, in water, in different contexts, because you think of climate and you think global climate change, but then the solutions are local, solutions are topical to one little ecosystem to one piece of land, right? So how to tailor it and how to bring the global agenda and implement it through finance. I think this is the role of the MDBs. And today, if I can say, the EBRD is also launching our climate adaptation action plan. Is not a financing plan, but is a strategy. It's a strategy to move in this direction. And to move in this direction, yes, we need partners, and we need a great partnership and a strong partnership between the public and the private sector, financing institution, and technical and specialized agencies. So I think we have quite a lot of work to do, but we are many.
Thank you very much, Iridia, also for reminding the importance of climate resilience at EBRD, the growing importance. We really believe that climate resilience, climate adaptation is an enabler to really sustain and preserve the economic development of our region, but also to maintain social cohesion. So we also want to bring that dimension. We still have a few minutes, so I would like to have a final question, the same question for everybody. In fact, I want to make it personal. I would like to hear from all of you what on your personal activity, on your professional activity, you're going to do next to address this problem of food security and climate change. What is your next activity? Vicky, maybe we start with you.
It's always challenging to go first and then to take it personal. I will say, as living in the United States, having not living in a place that's under a war zone, having the ability, a job, a livelihood, I'm healthy, all of the things that often we take for granted. One of the things I did this year was I started composting. It sounds ridiculous. It's not something that's actually available in my where I live, but was an actual, it sounds ridiculous, but is actually something I thought made me, I know, but it made me very aware of how much I consume, how much I buy, and how much I waste. And I think on that last point becomes increasingly important as we think about food, not only in my day job where we're thinking about how to channel money is how to channel resources, but I think that efficiency component becomes increasingly obvious when you start thinking about the waste that you have and how it compiles over time. And so that's a very personal note, but I think it relates to some of the micro data that you can do on an individual, the people that we talk to oftentimes, and how you can take things on personally to reflect the day-to-day.
Thank you very much for sharing this. I mean, this reminds me that I really hope that this COP is going to be not only the COP of implementation, but also the COP of responsibility. So you're giving us a very good insight about what responsibility means. Inka.
Vicky gave a very good idea. So I'm also thinking about, in my personal life, what I could do. At the moment, I'm thinking about actually behavioral science. And also I was thinking like, I have to reflect for myself, what is it that I'm doing now and how I can reduce my carbon footprint. At the moment, I'm thinking about the sustainable diet and the reduction of food waste. I think this is something that all of us can do quite easily. But then also on the professional side, because I'm working at the FAO, and this is the largest technical agency within the UN and with the mandate relating to food and agriculture. I think professionally what we could do more is to focus on the data. I like the point that Marta has made. At the moment, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of projects going on, but I think what is required is to have one repository agency that can collect and aggregate this data and enhance the accountability framework. And I think that will add, additional value to what a lot of individual entities are working on.
Thank you for sharing this. Before we go forward, we have a question from the audience. Can you please also introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. My name is Irina Maronova. I am from Ukraine, and I'm working at the local Zero Waste NGO, which is a part of the Global Alliance for Waste Incineration. And I'll pitch a little bit the gap that is here, and I was applauding to composting and also mentioning food loss from the farmers chain, and we haven't talked about food waste in the cities. Yesterday, I attended the launch of the IPCC summary report for urban policies, where they talk a lot about the importance and the very feasible tool as a waste prevention prevention, minimization, and good management. This COP is also about the methane treaty, and the methane from landfills accounts for 18% of the general landfill emissions, and it's all food. Food ends up on food waste ends up on landfills. But on the other hand, if you add also the carbon lost from soils, and we need to replenish it, so soils can be a good sequestration thing. So my question is, for EBRD, do you align your waste management policies and projects and agricultural projects? Because as far as I know, EBRD is the only European related, not fully European, not 100% European, but you're still financing incineration facilities and not putting enough forward, to my stand on promoting building composting facilities around the cities and putting back organics to the soil. Question, so can you respond on that? But I'll have two more questions for other panelists. To Carnel, the question is, do you account for carbon loss on your, that is under your operation? Because sunflower is actually extremely in soil intensive crop. And do you plan only to kind of diminish the what do you mean by the low carbon practices? Do you plan to actually invest into carbon sequestration project and bringing back from the communities that are around your fields in operation, waste from these cities, organic, separately collected organic waste, and cities need this investment. So it could be a good CSR projects for you. Do you work on that? And then for humanitarian aid, do you account for amount of plastics? Because because of war, yeah.
Thank you. So, Irina, do you want to?
Irina, thank you very much for your questions. And of course, this is a big topic. So the EBRD is in the Methane Pledge. So we support the initiative, and we also work on food waste in each and every typology of project that we have. Marta maybe can talk a bit more on what we did with Kernel on biomass, and maybe she can explain this, but we also work with our companies in the Baltics, in Moldova, and on Ukraine on organic, for example, and conversion of lands, right? From conventional agriculture to organic, and also with the farmers of these companies. And this has three main streams. One is really the efficiency of production, the different typology of production, and the minimization of waste. We also have an initiative on circular economy, which is quite big, and I'm happy to talk to you. And Tampiero is the director for the department that is actually dealing with this, maybe outside the panel, but yes, there are a lot of initiatives, and all of these initiatives are coming from private sector players. Technologies are there, the willingness is there, and we want to finance this opportunity. So for sure, we will be ready, and not only in Ukraine, but also in other countries. I don't know if Marta wanted to add a few things.
Yeah, just to add a little bit on the biomass side. So Ukraine is operating CHP, so combined heat and power panels. It is the $128 million investment project that was launched in a couple of years ago. And the end goal is to have 7 CHPs operating on our oil crushing plants. At the moment, we have only 3 CHPs operating due to the threats and disruptions happening in Ukraine. But what we do is that we burn our sunflower seed husk, which is considered to be a source for advanced biofuels according to the RED directive. We burn to produce the electricity. Before war started, we sold this electricity under the green tariff program to the national grid. At the moment, we are more redirecting to our own needs. But the thing is that the idea is that we've been trying to minimize our waste as much as possible from our production. And answering your question in terms of carbon footprint accounting, yes, we have been accounting, we have been undertaking in-depth accounting our GHG emissions from farming operations specifically. We've been also testing different tools such as Cool Farm tool, testing them in terms of the effectiveness and the rigorousness of data. The fact is that in terms of carbon farming, Kernel is already doing a lot of things. The majority of our land bank is already on reduced tillage. As you know, the majority of a lot of GHG emissions come from tillages of soil. We've been also applying inhibitors of fertilizers, and in some of the parts of our areas we've been growing cover crops just to make sure that the soil is as covered as possible. So I think it's quite challenging for us, having done so much already, to take steps forward each time, but we still see a lot of room for the improvement. And this is the direction in which we've been moving forward. And this is again where the availability of data and calculation is very critical, so that we know we can make a informed decision making on an operational level.
Thank you, Marta. Maybe let's remain with you to complete the.
I think was it on the personal or professional level? Because on the personal level, I can share.
As you wish, both personal and professional.
I think on a personal level, I think over the last year, I became very conscious about saving electricity. I felt like, I couldn't fully sleep if I know that somewhere the light is on. I think that was my main kind of epiphany for me. It's the first time that I felt that it's actually it's one thing when you save the electricity, it's another thing when you don't have it sometimes physically. So yeah.
Thank you, Iride.
Thank you. On a personal side, so for me also this COP was a bit eye-opening. I think I should talk more to young people. I think this is really the force of the future, and there are a lot of climate activists here and young generation, and somehow we don't connect as much. So my desire for next year, my wish would be to actually talk more to young generation and try to understand which are their needs, because in the end we need to leave this planet and the food system to them. So this is what I'm gonna do. Yes.
Anish, it's your turn.
Thank you, and thanks for putting me last. It gave me more time to think. But I'm really happy to share that starting of this year, actually, I have adopted two main goals as my personal goals. One is more on the carbon side, and the second is on water conservation. So I've started reducing my carbon footprint by trying to avoid taking unnecessary flights, which you generally need to take for leadership visits in many countries. Since we work in Africa and Asia and Europe, there's a lot of travel which involve. And I'm happy to share that year to date, which is starting from 1st April to today's date, I have already saved 12,000 kgs of carbon emissions by avoiding the flights that I could have avoided. And the second initiative that I've taken, as my sustainability manager told me, that each business card that gets fully produced, considering the water used, is around 20 liters of water which goes in production of each business card. So I have reduced the consumption of my own business cards by having QR codes on the cards and not exchanging cards with those people where I've already introduced to them either on email or from some other manner. So this helped me reduce my own usage of business cards from 300 per quarter to only 50, 60 cards per quarter. So these are the two things that I've adopted in my professional and personal side. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anish, for sharing. So I think we have reached the end of this session. I found it very interesting. So thank you so much for your contribution, strategic level, personal level, business level, policy level. This has been fantastic. So please join me in thanking and congratulating our panel. And thank you very much, and all the best for the rest of the COP. Thank you.
You were from